Welcome to this latest edition of the Cranky Curmudgeon's Corner. My name is Paul Thomas, and this episode we are going to be discussing a comparison between the wars in Gaza and the war in Vietnam. With us, we have two people who lived through the war in Vietnam, and that is John Cluthy and Mike Molesky. Welcome, panel. In looking at the reasons for conducting both wars, is it safe to conclude that for Vietnam, America had to stop the evil of communism? And for Gaza, Israel has to stop the evil of Islamic terrorism. If so, are both wars using similar justifications? Mike, what do you think about that?
No,
Not similar justifications?
no,
Okay.
and let me just sketch a little bit here. I'm going to be using, as we talk throughout the panel, references to two or three people and some events. The first person I'm going to reference is Frances Fitzgerald. And anybody who has been a student of Vietnam history knows she wrote the book back in the early 70s, Fire in the Lake, which was a look back at the Vietnam situation, particularly with the French and beyond. The second person that I'll reference is Richard Holbrooke. Richard died in 2010. He was a classmate of mine. I knew him fairly well. He had a brilliant career in the diplomatic service. In fact, he died in the then Secretary of State's office. He had been also a person who immediately entered the Foreign Service and served 6 years in Vietnam, speaking Vietnamese, and he'd already been fluent in French. He was also, I might add, the author of one volume of the Pentagon Papers, which was, for those who might be listening and need to be reminded, was a look at the decision-making that went into the entire Vietnam War. So when I look at it from that perspective of that book, those two people, and the work, Vietnam, I submit, was extraordinarily different, in part because we in the US were looking at it through 1960s, maybe 1950s, 1970 eyes. And the way we look at the Middle East today, the people involved, et cetera, I believe are entirely different.
Okay, but did those eyes that you're referring to in the 50s, 60s, and 70s consider communism as an evil that had to be stopped?
I believe that was more of a throwaway line. If you look more deeply into Kissinger and the other people, this was a cover. This was a cover for many other things.
I agree with that.
Yeah, yep. Go for it, John.
Well, the idea that we're fighting communism was a kind of a simplistic thing that was thrown out for the general population, but the origins were far more complex. There were economic factors. There were some cultural and political factors that were never really articulated during that time. I could go on to that for 40 minutes, but I won't. But yeah.
But as far as justifying it for the American public,
yeah,
was that the main thing that they used as justification?
That was the main justification. I remember I was in Conran Bay, and Lyndon Johnson flew in and gave us a speech. And in that speech, he did exactly that justification about why we were there, to save the world from communism. You know,
that was speech level.
Yeah.
I was in Washington, D.C. shortly in DC for about 4 years. And one of the people that I knew was a guy by the name of Smith. And Smith, you bring up Johnson, was sent by the president to Vietnam to get skinny on the numbers. Because as you all remember, one of the major issues, yeah, you know it well, was how many people are we killing? And this was an extrapolation from something that had been said in one briefing and bore no way anything close to reality. And he brought that message back, and that was a major turning point to understand that whether you were talking about the American people being shown what was happening or purporting to show what was happening in Vietnam, or even at the highest level, the president and others were cooking the books.
You know, I don't know who actually said this comment, but I remember hearing the old saying that in war, truth is the first casualty, and this was definitely the case there, and when I got there, I could see that what was happening before my eyes was very different from what we were hearing about.
There you go.
Okay, well, let me before I leave this question here, what I think we got an agreement on is the idea that the justification presented to the American people for Vietnam was to stop communism, and so that was why we were there. That was why we needed to be there. Now back to Gaza. What is happening over there now is not the same justification being used when Israel says we need to stop Hamas because they're a terrorist group, and that is basically an evil organization that needs to be eradicated. So aren't we now in Gaza trying to stop evil as well? John, do you see how I make that comparison, or don't you see that at all?
Well, I mean, the situations are very different because for Netanyahu, this war is happening within the boundaries of his own country. It's happening in his own backyard, and many people that he knows and their families and are all involved in this and dying in this. And on the other hand, the Vietnam War was very distant still for everybody. Not for those of us that were there eventually, but I think that the idea that people have to come up with a political justification, yeah, that's as old as the hills, and that's the truth. I mean, there is truth in it. The oversimplifications of why we're doing this. I just know that under the surface of that, there's a lot of other complicated things going on.
Okay, Mike, to finish this one up here, John brought out a good point about the oversimplification as the justification. Will you agree with at least that they are using this oversimplified justification of stopping evil as the reason why they need to continue this war in Gaza?
I hate to continue to be a naysayer, but no.
No, you are a naysayer. You were born as a naysayer, so let's not apologize for that.
Well,
that's your nature, buddy.
Let me just say this.
Oh, Vietnam veterans are naysayers. Come on.
let's put this into some perspective. We could go back 10,000 years, but I won't go back that far. This was an extraordinary event akin to the Japanese attacking at Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it was an extraordinary event. Now, there has been some reporting that suggests that a recently killed Hamas leader had wanted just this response from Israel. Israel played right down the line into his arms, if you say. He knew that he could provoke Israel. He was able to do it, planned it over a long period of time, and was willing to accept tens of thousands of people dying in Gaza and the horrific actions that the Israelis have provided. That was, if you believe that in one sense this was a certainly a long plan that worked, then you can see how Netanyahu is not the actor, but he's being directed by other forces and other people. We can talk about him being politically vulnerable. We can talk about his personality. We can talk about all those things. But I believe that the Israelis, in particular Netanyahu, have been played. And we're caught between oil and a hard place.
Yeah, to a degree. But I also
Moving
think
on.
Moving on.
Moving
Okay.
on. What
All right.
initiated my thinking about having this discussion was seeing that the protests on college campuses were similar. I was a college resident during the Vietnam War, and while there was already a civil rights protest movement underway beforehand, my recollection is that the Vietnam War protest movement didn't really gather enough steam to become meaningful until the college students became active in it. Is that how you remember it, John?
I honestly can't say I've thought that through very deeply, but I could see a lot of truth to that. And with the college students getting involved, then that means parents are seeing their sons that they sent off to school to get an education out there, burning their draft cards and smashing windows and things like that. It had a very sobering effect on people.
Yeah, my mother was not happy with me at all during those times. Yeah. Mike, you were in D.C. at the time. I think you were done with college.
Well, you're talking about an extended period of time. It depends when you want to begin the
That's
Vietnam
true.
era.
I mean, we can go back to the French.
Yeah, but if you want to, I graduated as an undergraduate in '62, so I encountered protests supporting fair play for Cuba back in '59. So we rolled into Vietnam, and probably '65 is where you want to look at that. In '65, I was in the Air Force, so I was immune. I mean, I was overseas. I was in Europe. I was doing other things. So I was looking from a distance at what was happening on campuses. But my sense about it is that you have to put that whole conglomeration of things. We're talking about the '60s. We're talking about Woodstock. We're talking about, this isn't just Vietnam that was the reason why everybody did what they did. There was a whole cultural shift going on that was, if anything, I believe, fostered by what was happening in Vietnam and the reaction. But it was a different era. Witness what's happening today when we talk about campus protests, particularly about Gaza. I believe that they are nowhere near on a scale similar.
Yeah.
Well, they seem to be over now.
Yeah. It's
that once the semester ended in May and restarted in September, there just didn't seem to be any kind of a effort that was projected last semester than this semester.
Exactly.
Not really, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, coverage of Vietnam was very one-sided until Walter Cronkite made it to a trip there himself. And upon his return, he delivered a scathing report which concluded that this war was unwinnable. So far, no such report has come from Gaza. So the question is there any journalist currently practicing with enough stature to make the kind of impact Cronkite had with the public during Vietnam?
With enough stature or courage.
Stature and courage. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying, John, that there isn't anybody with either stature or courage?
No, I wouldn't say that completely. The the cast of characters at this point is much wider and deeper than it was back then.
You're talking about the journalists that
Yeah,
wrote.
with journalists.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so I mean, you got half the country looking at Fox News, and the other half, looks at CNN and the twain shall never meet, and uh, that wasn't quite the case back in during Vietnam era. Uh, so, in terms of who could really be the spokesperson, whoever tries to step forward is going to be dismissed by the other side. It's going to be much harder for that to happen.
So Walter Cronkite was essentially was considered apolitical, more or less
Yeah,
a news reporter as opposed to a spokesperson for a particular ideology.
right. And then suddenly he was not apolitical, and it was putting everyone back on their heels. Yeah.
How do you see it, Mike?
Remembering that I'm coming from the perspective at the present time as a practicing journalist, we look very, very carefully at what's happening. Also, we're heavily involved in the variety of different ways in which information is disseminated, if you will. There was no social media back in the day that in any way rivals. So I would agree with you, but by saying in a sense, we have a lot more people, but we have fewer people who are, in my terms, credible. I look at people who do good work these days, whether it's on a national level or even locally. You can recognize good journalism, but it's also a fragmented world. When was the last time you and all your neighbors watched the same TV program?
Yeah. Yeah.
You have 100 choices. Yeah. So it's not so much. We have an abundance of people who are reaching to be a person who's providing you with information. A lot of wannabes, but I would say the winnowing that took place to produce a Cronkite in that environment doesn't happen the same way today.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
Which segues into the next question. Describe your analysis of the media coverage of Gaza in comparison to Vietnam. Now, I think we started that a little bit. Similarities? Any similarities or just differences, Mike?
Oh, I'm on the difference column. I mean, it's so different that it's hard to even begin to line them up and say, well, this is like that of the two eras comparison. The major, I have to tell you that fake news, whether it is facilitated by artificial intelligence, by state actors, is abundant. So you don't have to only say, well, let me look at CNN, Fox News, Al Jazeera, and see what the differences are. You have coming to your nearest Facebook posting something that looks really legitimate, that you're going to be asked to make up your own mind about because it's got real information, except it's not. And I think that has changed things so much so that the media coverage we have today of Gaza is almost on a different planet than what was done in Vietnam.
Okay, John. Mike is pretty leaning heavily on the differences of the two eras. Do you see any similarities, or you agree with him that it's all different?
Do I see similarities?
Yeah, between Vietnam, the media coverage of the two.
Oh, heck yeah. Oh, yes, and it may be my own bias, but when I see see the media, even though a lot of that seems like it's almost live, but it's just more fresh. But I tend to be a lot more skeptical about what I'm looking at because I can't always trust it because I had seen so much distortion in Vietnam, and it was, and it might still be the different news agencies, not just playing to the general public, but to the forces behind the scenes that are controlling the money that is going to affect what they say and how they say it.
Can you give me an example of a force controlling the money resulting in what they say? Can you give me an example of that?
No, I don't think I can directly. But
but we all feel it. We all feel
it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. How important is the longevity of American policy?
I beg your pardon, Paul.
Yes.
Mike had his finger up. He wanted to say something.
I put my finger up, Paul.
Oh, you wanted, before I moved on to the next question, you wanted to make another comment?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
You know, the media coverage, you were talking about someone putting their thumb. Well, I think he put more than his thumb. I think he put $1 billion on it. Bezos and the Washington Post thing, while it was specifically on something about the upcoming presidential election, demonstrated the willingness of money to affect editorial positions.
Oh yeah.
Clearly, now, yeah. Although that's not an example that relates directly to the war coverage, but it clearly is.
It extrapolates.
A good example, yes, a good example. Hey, you want to say any more about that, or is that all you wanted to point out?
That's it.
How important is the longevity of American policy in terms of a current policy remaining entrenched and unwavering, regardless of the well-documented humanitarian disaster in Gaza, as well as the West Bank? Since 1947, the United States has supported Israel's right to exist. Likewise, in Vietnam, the fight against communism was government policy even before World War II. We all remember the McCarthy years. Does the length of time a belief exists mitigate the possibility of change, even when said belief is discovered to produce horrific results? Joe Biden is an old dog that has been around for a long time, involved in American foreign policy, and that foreign policy was to support Israel. And as president, he has been unwavering in his support of that policy. Does the fact that he's been doing it so long have that kind of effect? Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, I would just point you to the young pup, Barack Obama. He didn't really have a different position with Israel. So we talk about the longevity of foreign policy, and yet we have watched that if deep policy has remained somewhat consistent because people can't figure out how to do anything else. Obviously, to my mind, what happened during the 4 years of Trump's administration was very different in the way we dealt with foreign policy than we did either with Obama or Biden. And so you're talking about levels of connection. And while we have generally said, even through all of that, we support Israel, it makes a huge difference who's doing the last mile of support and what that looks like.
Yeah, but even with Trump, the support of Israel was clearly there. Now, if this attack would have occurred during his administration, I very seriously doubt that he would have done anything to undermine what Netanyahu has done as far as conducting the war. Don't you think?
Well, I would just remind you of the people in the Middle East that he and his family were dealing with. You might want to look over to Saudi Arabia before you look at Israel.
Mm.
But actually, Israel and Saudi Arabia have become more on the same page
before Gaza.
Regarding Gaza and the whole Palestinian issue.
Yeah, but before
than they were since 1967.
Well, we could get into a long discussion about that, but I would just say that the Saudis have done a pretty good job of playing the U.S.
Oh yes, no doubt about that. Okay, John,
go for it.
Regarding the longevity of American policy, and even though there are some things that have happened in Gaza that, you know, Blinken and Biden and Harris has spoken in horrified fashion as far as the suffering of the Palestinians there. Do you think that longevity in time has made us more entrenched in looking at Israel in terms of supporting it, as opposed to criticizing it in terms of the way they've been conducting this war? What's your take on it?
I think you're just describing human nature in that regard, because because I think people have gotten entrenched in their thinking since before the pyramids were built, and it's but I do think that there are a multitude of other factors other than just that, and we need to see those, you know, those different perspectives also. The length of time, the length of time, what that really plays out to is the amount of money we spent on it and the amount of political capital that got spent. And those are all part of what can be described as the length of time.
Mm-hmm. The investment, the political investment and the monetary investment.
Yeah. And so that does affect it, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree on that, yeah.
Just a comment, I'll interject here. As many of you know, the Vietnam economy is booming. And tourists are welcome. I have a daughter and son-in-law who recently did a bike ride through both Cambodia and Vietnam.
Wow, really?
And I would just suggest it was done with ease. It was a wonderful experience, and they have some comparisons between the two countries. But I am aware of the general economic situation in Vietnam, which is doing very well. But I'm more interested when I talk to them about how they felt traveling along on a bike, where you might say, oh, well, that's interesting. I would never have thought that, maybe.
You know, when I was there, I commented to people that the reason I felt that communism could never take a deep hold in the hearts and minds of the people of that country, and was that everybody there was a small-time capitalist. Every mama-san, and you know, you go out on the marketplace and everybody was hustling for a buck and loving it. You know, I'm working hard, you know, and sometimes just living on peanuts, but and I'm sure that even after the communists seemingly took over, that never changed. What was still going on in the marketplace was small-time capitalism all the time.
That seems to be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what their main issue was to get the foreigners out of their country so they could make their own decisions. And once the foreigners were out, the decision was, hey, entrepreneurship. We like it. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Clearly, the war in Vietnam had a major impact on the 1968 presidential campaigns and subsequent election.
Yep.
How much has this Middle Eastern war affected this election, if at all? I think you're anxious to talk about the election here, Mike. So let's talk about it in terms of this war and its effect on it.
Well, first of all, I was in DC for 4 years, late '69 and into the '70s. So, I mean, I had an office across from the White House and watched Nixon's guards and all the rest of it develop and fall. And I would say that clearly this was one of the most extraordinary things that ever happened when you have a Nixon who is at the top of the game. He's done all this stuff, and he collapses. It's like, whoa, where did that come from? And we all know where it came from. And by the way, it did involve, the plumbers investigating in order to do something with the Ellsberg Pentagon Papers and Watergate. So this is all tied in together, et cetera. Now we fast forward to the present election, and I'd have to say it is. I mean, I've been watching, in particular, Nate Silver through his Silver Bulletin, who I believe is one of the best people to look at polls and different factors affecting the election. But he's not so far off from most people who are saying, this is so close to discern the effect on one or another of the candidates is really difficult. And I don't find it, certainly not like '68, and of course Johnson's removal. Yes.
So much less of an impact.
Oh, if it's existing, it's equal. It's affecting everything and not giving a person a reason to leave and not run.
Do you agree with that, John?
Yes, I would. Yeah. And I mean, you really don't even hear the war in Gaza talked about as a major consideration in the election.
True.
Yeah.
Just asking. One clear difference regarding America's role in each war is the fact that there was a draft during Vietnam, but there's no draft now. American boys were graduating from high school, trained in boot camp, and sent overseas to kill Asians. We are sending weapons to Israel, but any military personnel are located way out at sea, far from any serious fighting. Has this distinction affected the way American society has viewed each conflict? Estimates are that 2 million Asians were killed in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So far, some 43,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed in Gaza. Stark numbers in both cases. Was the draft a bigger issue with the American public's resistance to the Vietnam in comparison to the Gazan war? Because the draft no longer exists. John, you were right in the middle of that. So what's your take on that?
Well, I enlisted because I knew I was going to get drafted. Okay. And I wanted to be able to choose what military occupation I was going to have. I still ended up through a whole bunch of misadventures becoming a Green Beret, which I never planned to do. But the draft was profoundly affecting everybody. Every family either had someone they knew personally, or they knew people that they cared about, and relatives and friends that had something going on. This was a universal preoccupation, I think, in this country. And just the one military funeral after another was just, couldn't keep going on forever.
And had the people getting upset about it and resisting it.
Yeah, there was more resistance. There was more bitterness, more pointed questions being asked. Why the hell did my boy die? And you better give me a good answer or you're in trouble. I think that's one of the reasons why politicians don't want to send American boys there.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to find good justification.
Mike, you said earlier that you were in the Air Force, and then you ended up serving in Germany during all this. Was the draft a concern for you as you got to that age where you were eligible to be drafted?
No, a good friend of mine and I both joined the Air Force voluntarily after we finished our college years. He became a fighter pilot in Thailand and beyond. I went into another kind of service. I want to point out something that I noticed was missing here. We jumped from Vietnam to Gaza, and there were two other places, Afghanistan and Iraq. Losses, incredible losses that occurred throughout those wars. The length of those wars is a more dominant feature affecting how we deal with troops in Gaza today. Vietnam has faded, but Gaza and the tie to Iraq and Afghanistan, very, very real. So I think that's a much more powerful factor affecting how people are thinking today.
Yeah, because there were a lot of casualties in both those places.
Oh,
yeah.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're going to get into the politics in Israel now. That this war in Gaza is the main vehicle Netanyahu uses to stay in power and out of jail. You may recall that the largest electoral landslide in American history occurred in 1972 after Watergate burglary was reported to the American public. So the burglary took place before the election, and then the election took place, and I think McGovern won. Massachusetts was the only state he won that time. I believe that the Vietnam War ended only because the public sentiment, and John, you alluded to that earlier, forced the political establishment to the realization that we wanted it to end. Do you think the Israeli citizenry will follow a similar path, or will Netanyahu's strategy prevail in a never-ending war? Mike, I'm going to let you go first on this question.
Oh, very, very, very different. I think you have to understand, and I've sought to do that by having long conversations with people who are very familiar with the culture of Israel and the sense of what it is to be there, surrounded by literally enemies. And I think that plays to Netanyahu's advantage. I also believe that the present sort of unknown continuation of fighting between Iran and Israel is the key to it all.
Also,
because Iran is the big power,
right?
I mean, Saudi's got the money, but Iran has many things, including political fighting representatives in most of the other states in the area. They certainly have their own oil situation. They also have the potential in terms of population and military to be a very large force, and not to mention they have this nuclear potential. So I believe personally that the major thrust in all of this, Hamas, Hezbollah, those are way stations on dealing with Iran. And so Netanyahu has momentum still, got a lot of opposition in different ways, but he's still playing the card that says, are you with me? We are surrounded by enemies. We must make sure that what happened does not happen again. That's my thought.
Okay, John, put on your political hat here and tell me what you think about Netanyahu's strategy with this.
Well, first of all, I think it was accurate in terms of what we were just talking about, that the war has been ongoing for the Israelis ever since they were formed as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was that has always been a part of their consciousness and their lives. And so, yeah, they figure it's probably going to go on for generations more. Who knows? They're not necessarily expecting anything to end tomorrow. Americans tend to be a little more impatient about things. But
in Lebanon and in Gaza and even parts of the West Bank, they're active war zones now. I mean, there are troops parading the street with guns ready to shoot at anything that moves.
Yes, that's true.
So, I mean, there were periods since 1947 where it wasn't like this, but this is a very serious war going on right now, and a lot of civilians are being killed. So I don't know. I just asked the question about what Netanyahu's survival and his use of this war to enhance that survival. So I recently communicated with you guys, and that is a macro historical perspective on some possible mindsets in two countries that are currently involved. One with the Vietnam War, it was America, and with Gaza, it's Israel. But there was a mindset that was going on since 1492, basically generated out of Europe, that certain countries, meaning European countries, believed they could go out to the rest of the world because they had the capability of sailing to the rest of the world and taking possession of those territories. And the term that was used to describe this is colonialism. So basically, my question is, does this mindset of colonialism, which means we're stronger so we can take what we want from these people who are less than capable of defending what they have, must succumb to our desire to take over this area because we want it. And we're going to exploit the resources of these places because we can. Is this have anything in your mind with the way that America treated Vietnam and the French prior to America treated Vietnam and the way the Israelis are treating Gaza? That's just something that's been on my mind, so I thought I'd throw it out there. John, what about colonialism? Is that mindset part of this equation?
The way the Israelis are treating Gaza, colonial. I never thought about it in those terms. I always know that there are issues involved in wars that are really never talked about, that are frequently economic and cultural, etc. Sometimes cultural in the sense of rampant racism. But
well, there's a certain racism involved in colonialism.
Oh, absolutely, yeah,
okay.
yeah. In colonialism, the people doing the colonial takeovers felt that they were helping these poor, benighted people raise up their situation, and it was our white man's burden to do this, to help them, by taking over their countries, which was, pure bullshit. But that's the way they could actually get away with putting it. And it would never surprise me if someone was going to try to peddle that same bill of goods today, because recycling lies like that is as old as the pyramids. just like I referenced before.
So do you think that thinking, that what you just described as racist thinking, may be occurring now in Gaza?
Well, I'm just thinking now when I was in Vietnam, now being in special forces, we were very closely working with the Vietnamese, the civilians and the military, and we had friends there. The average American soldier, that was not the case. And I would listen to them, or other U.S. troops. They would just talk about we got to kill all the fucking gooks. That's the only thing they could think of, and they were just gooks. They weren't people. Later on, when I was studying all these issues of war, I realized that it was very important in wars in general for one side to dehumanize the other side, to make them less than themselves so that they could feel a little more comfortable killing them.
Yeah.
Because if they saw them just as people just like us, that would make them uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah. And that dehumanization would be encouraged and fostered by the people in power.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Mike, you understand why I brought this up?
Well, I'm not always sure why you bring anything up there, Paul, but my sense about the question is that colonialism is too nice a term. Because I see something like what Putin is doing with Russia and Ukraine as fitting the pattern. He just said, "I want it."
Right.
And I would also suggest that this somewhat similar. I watched a couple of interviews, and Tanishi Coates has a book out, Messages. He's gotten some pushback about what he did there. He visited Israel, but one thing that struck me from what he experienced, he said, "I'm a black man. I can tell you that I could go to Israel and I felt more comfortable there than I do in some parts of the South in the United States because I wasn't Palestinian. But if you were Palestinian, you were back in the 50s and 60s in the South."
Yeah.
It's not a democratic balanced thing. Even though you're living there in Israel, you are a second-class segregated person if you're Palestinian.
Yeah.
So I leave that.
Okay, this is a good segue to the next question. There are two phrases recently used that both represent bigotry: anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Supporters of Israel have, with legitimate justification, claimed that anti-Semitism is on the rise. And there's clear evidence of that. Palestinian supporters make the argument that Israel is engaging in genocide against that ethnic group. How do you view this issue? Is either side more right than the other? Okay, now I'm going to get to the second part of this question. Does it go back to Vietnam and the Asian race, whom we called Orientals back in the day? John, you referred to them, some of your comrades called them gooks. It was only 2 decades after the end of World War II, and we saw an abundance of war movies where Orientals portraying Japanese soldiers were seen by the American movie viewers as pure evil.
Yep.
The question is, did that conditioning help create a mindset that these Vietnamese Orientals didn't deserve to be treated any better than the Japs we defeated in 1945? So the overall theme of this lengthy diatribe I've just gone through, and this drives my producer crazy, by the way, when I go about it this way, is about the racist bigotry component of both wars. I think we alluded to that earlier. Was it then, and is it now, a consideration worth looking at? Mike, you kind of like laid it out on the last answer. Is there anything more you want to comment about the racism
Well,
and the other.
I'm going to end with a yes.
Okay, John.
Yes.
Racism a big part of it, John?
You're muted, John.
John, you just muted yourself. You got to unmute. John, hey, John, you got to unmute. Peggy, help John unmute, please. Here she comes to the rescue. Somewhere on the screen, you're going to find mute a microphone there. Just press. There you go. Hey, you're unmuted. Start from the beginning.
Okay, very good. Okay, so basically, what I was saying is that it is my premise that in practically every war, one side is dehumanizing the other to some degree. That is just elemental to that process of killing somebody else to create some kind of justification to be able to do it. But and those of us who participated in the process of pulling the trigger on another human being in those wars still live with the moral struggles late at night. So
let me ask you this then: Have you reconciled within yourself that these people in Vietnam were not, as your other Army comrades characterized them, as less than like normal people like we are?
Oh, I have long since come to see them as just very normal people, you know. Yeah. And they are now a major part of our population now.
Sure.
Especially in California. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right around where I grew up. Yeah.
Final question of the day, fellas, and I really appreciate the insights that you have thrown into this discussion. How do you see this thing in Gaza? And I'm talking about the fighting, the street fighting that's going on over there, and the bombings and the killings of civilians in the hospitals and the schools and all that. And I guess Lebanon now too with Hezbollah. How do you see this being resolved? John, do you see it being resolved at all, or is this going to be a never-ending war?
Oh, eventually the actual fighting and shooting will come to some kind of wearing itself out. Or, rarely does it come with people, shaking hands and making truces, but wars tend to just exhaust themselves. But
is that how you think this is going to happen? They're just going to
more than likely, yes. Yeah, more than likely, I think it's going to happen that way, and it's going to be which in a way leaves it unresolved and waiting for the next flare up.
Yep.
But sadly, that's the way it could probably go.
So a reduction in violence, but no real resolution.
Basically.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Mike, is that what you see?
Well, the factor that I think is most important here is because of the extensive damage done in Gaza. I mean, incredible damage.
Oh, God, yes.
I'm not sure where the rebuilding, if you will, or movement of that population can occur with resources that are also being sucked away to Ukraine and other parts of the world. I think that's the biggest takeaway, that this is World War II scale in a focused area damage, and that's a consideration. If you stop, what do you do? It's not like, oh, we'll just send in all of the helping agencies and they'll take care of that, and everybody throws in a few billion and we'll rebuild.
Well, the Marshall Plan didn't occur until after Germany surrendered. And
Right.
the Marshall
Well,
Plan that took place in Japan after Japan surrendered, if there's no surrender, no Marshall Plan.
I'm just saying, what this will take in resources is on a very large scale, and will still not deal with the biggest issue of how do you get two disparate populations living together comfortably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
you're basically saying no resolution either.
I'm with John. This is a roller coaster.
Okay.
It comes up, it goes down, up and down. Once they recover enough to gather a few more weapons together and go back again. Unless something strange really happens, that's where I'd be.
So I want to thank Mike and John. This was very enlightening. And all you out there in Cyberland, thanks for listening to this very enlightened discussion. Until next time, bye now.